A giant shadow has just entered the war, and it is not a missile, a drone, or a speech. It is a floating airfield, a city of steel, a warning so massive it can be seen from space. For weeks, Iran's Revolutionary Guard believed the Strait of Hormuz could become the perfect trap. Narrow waters, global panic, rising oil prices, nervous governments. One wrong move by the West, and Tehran believed the entire region could be forced to back down. But what happened next changed everything. Instead of fear, the answer was force. Instead of hesitation, more warships came. And now, the very choke point Iran hoped to weaponize may be turning into the pressure chamber that squeezes Iran itself. So how did the trap backfire this badly? And why does the arrival of this enormous new force make the next stage of the war more dangerous than anything we have seen so far? Right now, the battlefield is no longer just in the sky over Iran or across the missile corridors of the Middle East. It is in the water. It is in the ports. It is in the invisible lines of oil, trade, and military movement that keep the global economy alive. In the last phase of this war, the United States surged one of the largest military buildups the region has seen in decades. Carrier strike groups, destroyers, advanced fighters, refueling aircraft, missile defense batteries, stealth bombers, surveillance planes, electronic warfare assets. And then came the moment that changed the entire picture. A third American aircraft carrier moved into the wider theater, joining an already extraordinary concentration of combat power. That was not just reinforcement, that was a message. Because aircraft carriers are not just ships. They are mobile runways, missile shields, command centers, and symbols of political intent. One carrier is pressure. 2 carriers are a crisis. 3 carriers signal something else entirely. They signal endurance. They signal escalation capacity. They signal that this is no longer a limited demonstration, but a structure built to absorb retaliation and keep fighting. And that matters, because Iran's strategy depended on the opposite. It depended on making the cost of staying too high. The Revolutionary Guard believed that if it could turn Hormuz into a zone of fear, if it could make every tanker captain, every insurer, every trader, every foreign navy think twice, then time would begin to work for Tehran. The idea was simple. Do not defeat your enemy head-on. Make the battlefield so dangerous, so uncertain, and so economically painful that your enemy begins to question the mission. In theory, that strategy made sense. Hormuz is one of the most important maritime choke points on Earth. A huge share of the world's oil and gas moves through that narrow waterway. Even a partial disruption can send shockwaves across continents. Markets react. Shipping costs surge. Governments panic. Alliances strain. That was the logic behind the threat. Iranian messaging around the Strait grew sharper and more theatrical. The Revolutionary Guard declared that hostile vessels could be caught in what it called a deadly vortex if they made the wrong move. The image was clear. Fast boats, mines, anti-ship missiles, drones, coastal batteries, commercial traffic caught in the middle, a battlefield where even a small clash could trigger global consequences. Tehran wanted the world to believe it could turn geography into leverage. However, this is where things take a serious turn. The same threat that was supposed to scare opponents into restraint instead gave them a reason to expand the war architecture around Iran. Once commercial shipping, energy transit, and strategic sea lanes came under direct pressure, the conflict stopped looking like a contained military showdown and started looking like a systemic threat. That changes everything. When a regional war threatens global energy flows, major powers do not just watch, they harden positions. They move assets, they prepare for a longer fight. And that is exactly what happened. American naval power did not shrink back from the Gulf theater. It grew. Destroyers equipped for missile defense and long-range strike operations became central pieces of the picture. Mine countermeasure assets grew more relevant. Early warning aircraft and airborne command platforms helped knit the battle space together. Fighter aircraft spread across regional bases. Patriot and THAAD systems were positioned to blunt incoming missile attacks. Stealth bombers remained part of the equation, not merely as symbols, but as reminders that hardened targets deep inside Iran could still be reached. What most people do not realize is that wars are often decided not by the first dramatic move, but by who can survive the consequences of that move. Iran's threat in Hormuz was dramatic, but the response was logistical, industrial, and layered. And layered power is much harder to break. To understand why this matters, we need to step back for a moment. For years, Iran built a regional deterrence model based on depth, deniability, and asymmetry. It invested in proxies, missile stockpiles, drones, coastal defenses, underground sites, and naval harassment tactics. The goal was not necessarily to dominate conventional warfare against stronger militaries. The goal was to make any attack on Iran so messy, so expensive, and so regionally contagious that adversaries would stop short. That model often worked by creating gray zones, enough pressure to intimidate, but not always enough to trigger total war. But this war shattered the gray zone. Once major strikes, counterstrikes, shipping threats, and regional spillover began to stack on top of each other, the old balance became harder to maintain. Iran was no longer operating in the shadows of plausible deniability. Its tools were now being tested under the pressure of a direct and sustained campaign. And this is where the trap began to backfire in stages. The first stage was military. Iran threatened the Strait, but that threat encouraged a larger maritime response, not a smaller one. More escorts, more surveillance, more strike capacity, more planning for mine clearing and interdiction. The waterway Iran hoped to dominate became one of the most heavily watched spaces in the world. Every boat movement, radar signal, aircraft launch, and coastal action mattered more. The battlefield became crowded with sensors. In a crowded sensor environment, surprise starts to die. The second stage was economic. Tehran's pressure campaign was supposed to raise costs for everyone else, but blockades and interdictions do not just punish importers and insurers. They can choke the exporter too. Iran's economy depends heavily on energy sales. Once pressure on shipping intensified and routes became constrained, Iran faced a growing problem at home. Oil that could not move out had to go somewhere. Storage pressure rose. Workarounds became uglier and less efficient. Reports began to point to extreme measures, including struggling to find spare storage and relying on slower alternative logistics. That is not the image of a state turning the world hostage. That is the image of a state feeling the squeeze itself. The third stage was industrial. Combined strikes and wartime disruption reportedly hit important parts of Iran's steel sector, a vital component not only for revenue, but for domestic manufacturing capacity tied to the war effort. When a country is forced to think about preserving industrial stock for internal use while also trying to sustain military output, the strategic picture starts to narrow. Options become more painful. Every missile launched, every drone assembled, every repair completed begins to compete with the deeper question of what can still be replaced. Then came the political stage. And this may be the most dangerous one of all. External pressure tends to produce one of two outcomes inside a state under siege. It either hardens unity or it exposes division. Signs emerged that Iran's leadership was not fully aligned on how to handle the pressure, particularly on the sequence of military de-escalation, blockade relief, and nuclear negotiation. That uncertainty matters. A divided command structure is vulnerable not just because it is weaker, but because it becomes less predictable. One faction may want time. Another may want escalation. One may see talks as survival. Another may see talks as surrender. And when the chain of decision-making gets cloudy during war, the risk of sudden miscalculation goes up. But what happened next changed everything again. Instead of waiting for Iran's pressure strategy to burn itself out, Washington and its partners kept thickening the military ring. By late April, the concentration of American naval power was impossible to ignore. Multiple carrier strike groups were either already in the region or flowing into it. Amphibious assets added flexibility. Destroyers created overlapping layers of air defense and strike capability. Bombers, fighters, support aircraft, and surveillance systems turned the theater into a constantly connected battlespace. This was more than muscle. It was a direct answer to the IRGC concept of controlled chaos. Tehran had hoped chaos would discourage intervention. But once the response became organized, networked, and sustained, chaos started working against Iran instead. Every disruptive move risked justifying another reinforcement. Every attack on shipping risked deeper enforcement. Every threat to close the Strait risked proving the argument for keeping overwhelming force in place. And this is why the arrival of something massive matters so much. Because when another giant platform enters a war like this, it is not just bringing aircraft. It is bringing time. It is bringing sortie generation. It is bringing flexibility. It is bringing the ability to absorb losses and continue operations. It is bringing confidence to allies and pressure to enemies. Most importantly, it tells Tehran that the clock may not be moving in its favor anymore. Think about the psychology of that. Iran's strategy was built on the assumption that outside powers have limited patience, that they fear long wars, rising prices, dead sailors, regional escalation, and political backlash. And that assumption is not irrational. Great powers do get tired. Democracies do debate costs. Coalitions do fracture. But when those same powers decide the cost of inaction is even greater, the entire equation flips. Suddenly, the side trying to impose pain discovers it has invited a larger and more durable military presence than expected. We are now watching that inversion in real time. The Strait of Hormuz was supposed to be Iran's leverage point, a narrow artery through which fear could travel faster than any missile. But leverage only works if the other side cannot or will not build a counter-system around it. That counter-system is now visible. Warships with missile defense and strike roles, aircraft that can patrol, jam, relay, refuel, and hit targets, layers of regional basing, allied coordination, maritime enforcement, and behind it all, the simple reality that a blockade against Iran's exports can become just as punishing as Iran's threat against the world's shipping. That is the cruel irony at the center of this war. Tehran tried to create a choke point for everyone else, and now it is discovering that choke points cut both ways. However, this does not mean Iran is finished. Far from it. The Revolutionary Guard still has tools, missiles, drones, coastal launchers, naval swarms, regional networks, the ability to target bases, energy sites, shipping lanes, and political psychology. Even a weakened strategy can remain lethal. A cornered actor can be more dangerous, not less. And this is why the current moment is so unstable. The trap may have backfired strategically, but tactically, Iran can still raise the price of every step taken against it. That is why the next phase matters more than the last. Once a state realizes its original coercive design is failing, it has a choice. Pull back and negotiate from a weaker position, or escalate in search of a dramatic reset. History is filled with governments that chose escalation because the alternative felt like humiliation. A ship hit in the wrong place. A base attack that kills more than expected. A successful strike on a symbolic target. Any one of those could suddenly turn a pressure campaign into a regional inferno. And there is another layer most people are missing. This war is not only being fought with missiles and carriers. It is being fought with endurance. Can Iran keep its economy functioning under maritime pressure? Can it keep moving oil? Can it preserve industrial capacity? Can it protect internal cohesion while facing external attack? Can it sustain proxy pressure while also defending the homeland? Those are slower questions, but they may decide more than the nightly headlines. And for all the drama of missiles in the sky, wars of endurance often break states from the inside outward. Storage shortages, export disruption, damaged industry, leadership friction, popular exhaustion, security overstretch. None of those make the same noise as an explosion, but together they can transform the balance of power. And that brings us back to the massive arrival now reshaping this conflict. A third carrier does not guarantee victory. A giant military buildup does not erase risk. But it does send a brutal signal. The campaign against Iran is not being designed for a quick photo opportunity. It is being structured to continue, to defend, to strike, to deter, to blockade, to outlast. Look at how the map has changed around this conflict. In the Arabian Sea, carriers and escorts extend air power far beyond the shoreline. In the Gulf, missile defense and maritime patrol create overlapping layers of protection and surveillance. In regional bases, fighters and refueling aircraft reduce the distance between warning and response. Above it all, command and relay aircraft help tie sea, air, and land into one system. That matters because Iran's trap depended on fragmentation. It depended on separate fears, separate timelines, separate reactions. But the more integrated the opposing force becomes, the less room there is for Iran to exploit confusion. There is also a symbolic humiliation here that Tehran cannot easily hide. For years, the Revolutionary Guard sold itself as the guardian of strategic initiative, the force that could shape events through pressure, patience, and carefully calibrated risk. Yet the current picture suggests the opposite. Iran issued warnings. The other side answered with heavier deployments. Iran threatened shipping. The other side built a wider enforcement structure. Iran signaled that approaching the Strait would be perilous. The other side kept moving in. That does not erase Iran's ability to strike, but it weakens the aura of control that the Guard has long tried to project. An aura matters in war. Deterrence is partly material, but it is also psychological. A commander who looks in control can win concessions without firing. A commander who appears cornered invites pressure. That is why the arrival of another giant platform is so consequential. It tells every observer in the region that Washington believes it can stay in the fight, manage the risks, and keep the pressure on. It tells Gulf states that the maritime contest is not being abandoned. It tells Israel that support architecture remains intact. And it tells Tehran that the threat of escalation has not produced retreat. But what happened next may decide whether this becomes a grinding contest or a sudden explosion. The more crowded the theater becomes, the smaller the margin for error. A radar lock mistaken for an attack. A drone misread as a decoy. A fastboat push that goes too far. A missile launched for signaling that lands as a massacre. In a region this armed, accidents can become strategy before leaders even understand what happened. That is exactly what Iran did not want. Because in this war, size is not only about tonnage, it is about staying power. It is about who can keep aircraft flying, ships moving, interceptors loaded, and pressure a constant long after the headlines fade. And right now, that balance appears to be shifting more decisively against Tehran. The Revolutionary Guard wanted the world to picture enemy ships trapped in a deadly vortex. Instead, Tehran now faces a different kind of vortex, a tightening ring of surveillance, naval pressure, economic strain, and strategic isolation. The more it tries to prove the Strait is its weapon, the more justification it gives its enemies to keep building the force needed to neutralize that weapon. The more it leans on disruption, the more it risks deepening the blockade that is already squeezing its own lifelines. In other words, the trap did not fail because it was imaginary. It failed because it triggered a response bigger than the planners expected. This is the part of the story where some people assume the ending is obvious. It is not. Wars become most dangerous when one side realizes its leverage is slipping. That is when desperate moves become tempting. That is when signals become harder to read. That is when commanders convince themselves that one shocking blow can restore deterrence. So watch what happens next, not just in Tehran, but in the waters around it. Watch the carriers, watch the destroyers, watch the shipping lanes, watch the skies over regional bases. Watch whether Iran keeps threatening the Strait or starts looking for a way out of the corner it created. Because the biggest question now is no longer whether the IRGC can create danger. It clearly can. The real question is whether it can do that without accelerating the very military and economic pressure that is closing in around it. Something massive has entered the war. But the deeper story is not the size of the ship. It is the collapse of an assumption. Iran believed it could turn geography into immunity. It believed the fear of escalation would protect it. It believed the world would blink before the costs became too high. Instead, the costs became the reason a larger force arrived. And now the war has entered a colder, harsher phase, one where symbolism is backed by logistics, one where every threat at sea can justify another layer of containment, one where the side that tried to weaponize the bottleneck may be the one discovering how little room it has left to maneuver. If that realization has truly set in inside the Revolutionary Guard, then the next move could be restraint. But if it has not, then this story is heading toward an even darker chapter. Because when a trap backfires in wartime, the people who built it do not always admit the mistake. Sometimes they double down. And if that happens here, the waters of Hormuz will not just decide the fate of a shipping route. They could decide whether this war remains brutal but contained, or explodes into the full regional confrontation the world has feared from the beginning.